We assume that the materials existing today, the confirmations that were made these days by the Ukrainian side and by the United States of America, there was a statement made by the Deputy Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, leave no doubt, will not leave an opportunity for Washington to keep silence this time. We remember how many years and also their attempts while spilling blood to find biological and chemical weapons throughout the world, while in fact occupying, killing people. They were looking in the wrong place. We have found instead of you. We have found your own products. We have found your biological material. It was developed primarily for military purposes. As it turns out, it was all happening in Ukraine. What were you doing there? It's a different continent. It has no borders with you. There are no bases of yours. What were they doing there under the guise of scientific research? Your specialist, among others. On a regular basis, they were giving instructions to the Ukrainian side as to the purposes of their studies involved. Now, considering that we have the evidence that cannot be refuted, we demand that you provide details. The world must know what were you intending to do there, to what end, within which deadline, what was the amount of the so-called investments in the biological activities of Ukraine. The data, materials, documents, please provide them. Enough game.
Given the events of the past 2 weeks, Russia's warnings for NATO to halt expansion towards its territory seem to have been all but forgotten. But they were acknowledged by the West more than 2 decades ago when the current US president warned that NATO expansion into Eastern Europe could provoke Russia.
I think the one place where the greatest consternation would be caused in the short term would be to admit the Baltic states now in terms of NATO-Russian, US-Russian relations. And if there was ever anything that was going to tip the balance, were it to be tipped in terms of a vigorous and hostile reaction, I don't mean military, in Russia, it would be that.
NATO, nevertheless, did expand into the Baltic states, and despite there still being no direct confrontation with Russia, the military alliance is upping its combat readiness, with Latvia recently announcing an increase in its military budget to reach NATO target figures. A former NATO Supreme Allied Commander said President Putin's actions have reinvigorated the alliance.
I spent 4 years as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. At every conference, every meeting of high-level NATO officials, I would find my way to Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany and the Minister of Defense, Ursula von der Leyen, and I would say to them, you've got to raise your defense spending. And I got nowhere in 4 years. In 48 hours, Vladimir Putin has inspired the Germans to effectively nearly double their defense budget, a smart move on the part of Germans. Vladimir Putin may be the best thing that ever happened to the NATO alliance.
You have the impression that Western leaders are going on with a sort of living in a fiction world, heading us all toward disaster as if they didn't notice it. I mean, they're heading us for economic disaster. They're heading us for world war, just in order to show that they are more democratic than other parts of the world. And in Russia, it's all virtue signaling. And these leaders are not looking out for the welfare of their countries at all. They're just taking wild risks. There's also people calling for actually getting NATO into a war with Russia over Ukraine, which is, of course, totally insane, but that exists. And I don't see sensible people I mean, there are sensible people in the West. In the United States, there are sensible people, but they are very far out of power. been marginalized.
If, for instance, the Polish government, a NATO member, wants to send fighter jets, does that get a green light from the U.S., or are you afraid that that will escalate tension?
No, that gets a green light. In fact, we're talking with our Polish friends right now about what we might be able to do to backfill their needs if, in fact, they choose to provide these fighter jets to the Ukrainians. What could we do? How can we help to make sure that they get something to backfill the planes that they're handing over to the Ukrainians?
They tell us that Vladimir Putin is unbalanced. We'll take that at face value. We know that Putin has thousands of nuclear weapons. Putin has said that if he is pushed, he will use nuclear weapons. Could be wise to believe him. Harry Kazianis does believe him. Kazianis is a foreign policy analyst in Washington. Like a lot of people in his business, he regularly participates in government-sponsored war games. These are designed to map out what would happen if various countries fell into conflict with one another. A couple of years ago, not long ago at all, Kazianis participated in a war game predicated on a war with Russia. He wrote about this the other day in The Federalist, quote, "In the course of what we call the NATO-Russia war of 2019, we estimated 1 billion people died. 1 billion. And if we aren't careful, what happened in a simulation could happen if a NATO-Russia war erupts over Ukraine." That war has just erupted.